Good evening. I am Gaurav Pranami, the president of ISU Vegetarians and Vegan Student Organization at Iowa State University. And on behalf of our club, I'm proud to welcome you all to the part 1 of Sustainable Food Conference sponsored by ISU Lectures Committee. Every year we try to bring in renowned experts to Iowa State to raise awareness about how our food choices relate to most pressing issues around us, such as human health, environment, world hunger, animal protection, and our cultural and spiritual growth. This year we are very excited to have Dr. Will Tuttle here. He will lead a panel discussion on the effects of animal agriculture on world hunger and environment, and he will be joined by Harold Brown and Dr. Clark Ford. Dr. Will Tuttle has lectured and performed widely throughout North America and Europe. He is the author of the groundbreaking book, The World Peace Diet, and is the recipient of the Peace Abbey's Courage of Conscience Award. He is a Dharma master in Zen tradition and has practiced meditation for over 30 years, studying contemplative Christianity and a variety of non-Western spiritual traditions. His PhD dissertation in education from University of California, Berkeley focused on educating intuition in adults and was nominated for the Best Dissertation Award. He has taught college courses in creativity, humanities, mythology, religion, and philosophy, and has created 7 CD albums of original piano music. He is noted for his clear and inspiring presentations that include original music as well as evocative art by his spouse, Madeline, a visionary artist from Switzerland. So, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Will Tuttle.
Okay, how's everybody doing? You're all nice to be warm enough in here. I'd like to just start by giving the ISU Vegetarian Vegan group a big hand. Let's just honor them. They've put a lot of work into this. Thank you, Gaurav and everyone. This has been, it's quite a bit of work to set up a mini conference like this. And as you all know, we are here to talk about the effects of animal agriculture. And I guess maybe at the very beginning I'll just mention the paintings that you see up here around are by my spouse Madeline, who's in the back there. She's from Switzerland. She's the artist in the family. I'm the musician. And so the sense I have is that even though it's just human beings in the room, we're really talking not only about human beings. There are other beings on this planet that also have interests, and whose interests I think many times are just sort of brushed under the rug, but that as we bear them in mind, just kind of be aware that in a sense they're also listening and watching what's going on in the room. I think in a sense everything that we do affects non-human animals enormously. And yet we've been born into a culture that basically treats them as if they're commodities that have no feelings or interests at all. How many people in here think that you're pretty knowledgeable about the food system in the United States, especially in terms of what animals endure for food and the repercussions of all that and so forth? How many people have kind of studied that somewhat? Some of you? How many people don't really want to know too much more, at least about the animal suffering? I know, that's understandable. What I'd like to do for the next few minutes is just sort of talk a little bit about the underlying issues that we are going to be addressing for the next this evening and tomorrow, the next 2 evenings, and then we'll jump right into the first presentation, which will be with Harold Brown. So I'm the author of this book, which I'll be mentioning probably from time to time. It's called The World Peace Diet: Eating for Spiritual Health and Social Harmony. And I think the inspiration really for the conference and for this tour that we have, Madeline and I are now living in a solar-powered RV. We're in our 13th year, full-time on the road, traveling and doing lectures, presentations, as well as concerts and art exhibits, to basically help raise awareness about the effect of our lives on the planet, and in essence, to especially draw attention to the ramifications of our meal choices, of our food choices, that in our culture we basically don't want to think about this too much. And I think there's good reasons why we don't want to think about it. We'll be going into some of those reasons. And the whole idea here really is for us to create a positive and nurturing environment where we can explore ideas together. The idea, I think, underlying a lot, at least of my work, is that there's no reason for anyone to feel guilty about eating animal foods, if that's what we're doing. All of us have been forced into it by our culture. No one chooses on their own to do it. I just really don't see that at all. No one chooses on their own to eat the flesh or secretions of animals. It's something that we all do because of the communities we've been raised in. We've been raised in, our parents, our grandparents, our neighbors, our friends, our ministers, our doctors, the media. Really, boy, they really push it hard. And so we don't choose this on our own. And I think it would be hard for us to ever even come up with it. Honestly, I think we would never think of especially something like the milk of cows. I think that would be really a stretch to think of that on one's own. I think because we see animals sometimes lactating, right? Sometimes occasionally you'll see a dog or a cat or nursing their young, and we don't have this burning desire to push them away and suckle up there ourselves. But somehow, if it's a cow, we just gotta have it, And so I don't think we would ever no one would ever choose to drink the milk of another species on our own. But it's provided to us, it's not really provided, it's basically forced on us by our culture, and it's provided for us by our culture in nice little packages, and so we find ourselves just basically in a cultural situation where everyone's eating dairy products as well as meat and eggs. And there are huge repercussions of this that are covered up. So maybe I'll just say very briefly how I came to a few of these ideas. And just to let you know, I wasn't born a vegan. I have been a vegan. Did you say how long? I can't remember. No. Anyway, I've been a vegan for 28 years, roughly. Vegetarian maybe 33 or something. And I was born into a typical, really, just totally typical eating family. It was in Massachusetts, and we ate the usual diets of lots of meat, dairy, and eggs, and I never questioned it, and I totally understand not questioning it, because I never did. Even all the way up through college, I never questioned it at all. But in a sense, I had not even a context to question it at all. It just couldn't even happen. I was born back in the early 1950s, and I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I asked my mother, I said, so, is this what everybody eats? And she said, yeah, it's what everybody eats. And then she said, well, there are vegetarians, but she said it in the way like, don't worry, you will never meet one. They live, maybe in India, there's a few half-dead vegetarians over there, but they're on another planet, basically. They don't really exist. They're sort of hypothetical people. And so that was it, and I never questioned it. I remember going away to different, learning to fish and learning on this one farm I went to for 2 summers. We learned to catch our own chickens. This was this idyllic Vermont dairy farm where there were so the chickens were sort of running around and they were in coops at night, and we were taught to catch our own chicken and put her down on this board on the ground and hold her neck through these 2 nails and then cut her head off with our little axe and watch her run around with no head, spouting blood, and then pick her up and run her through the skull tank and eat the chicken. And I remember just not minding that at all. I knew by that time, I'd gone through probably 12 or 13 years, that's about how old I was, of a very intense indoctrination by my community, by everyone who was around me, and I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that chickens don't have a soul. God put them here for us to eat. Basically all these animals that we use for food, cows, pigs, chickens, turkeys, ducks, fish, God gave them us to eat, and their interests don't matter at all, and besides that, they taste good. And besides that, if I didn't eat them, within 24 hours I would just keel over and die of a protein deficiency. There's no question about it. It's just either like them or us, you got to kill them or you'll die. So it didn't bother me, and plus, I was a tough young guy. I thought, no problem. And I remember we also killed a cow. I won't go into that, but we killed our own cow. We shot her with a gun in the head and did the whole thing. And it was pretty shocking to see, because this wasn't just a small animal like a chicken. This was a 2,000-pound huge animal with urine and feces gushing everywhere. She was convulsing in huge amounts of blood. And so it was very shocking just to see it. But still, I never questioned it in the slightest, because I knew that this was the way God wanted things. This is the way we have been doing it forever, literally forever. And so I never questioned it. And eventually, I was able to, I found myself when I was about, 22, in a community in Tennessee. This was back in 1975. And it was what we would call today, a vegan community. It was a large community called The Farm. Has anyone ever heard of The Farm in Tennessee? Some of you may have heard of The Farm. It was pretty famous, actually, in its day, in its heyday. It's still going. But it was mainly people from California, and they were living. And so I remember being in this community, and they didn't eat any animal foods at all. They grew their own food, and so I found myself in this community of basically 1,000 people who were healthy, strong, creative, and just enormously inspiring people, actually, in a lot of ways. And they didn't eat one little bit of animal food. That was part of their thing. And they did it because they didn't want to cause cruelty to animals. That was the main reason. Plus, there's environmental benefits, as you all know, health benefits. But the main reason was to minimize the amount of violence in their lives, the amount of violence they were causing, and suffering and misery and fear and pain and so forth. And so, between the two things, one was, on the one hand, everyday eating, with all these people, plant-based meals, and that were really, it took a little getting used to, I will have to admit, maybe, I don't know what it was, a few weeks. And then, on the other hand, just hearing a little bit about what these animals go through. They told me, because I would ask them, well, what is it exactly? And I think we all kind of know these things, especially today. Back then it was maybe less known, but what the routine that animals endure in animal agriculture, I think really, whether it's factory farms or not, it's basically very similar. And most animals, of course, are in what we call factory farms, but their babies are stolen from the mothers. Typically, the beaks of chickens are chopped off and they're crammed into cages, and they get castrated without anesthesia. And this whole world is like looking into this dark world of hyper confinement and mutilation and fear, terror, misery, drugs, violence, and at the same time, seeing happy, healthy, creative people. About 100 kids were vegan from birth, and they were just doing great. And so they had the first soy ice cream. I'm telling you, soy ice cream's come a long way since 1975. It wasn't nearly as rich as what you can get today. But, when that's all you had, it was pretty good, So anyway, and I remember the guy was showing us around too. He was kind of walking, he was kind of showing us around the place, and at one point he said, "Yeah, and I'm wearing vegetarian shoes." And that was like too much. I was like, wow, and they don't even wear leather either. So anyway, I've never eaten meat again in my life. I ended up, surviving, obviously, and it's been an absolutely fabulous experience to be a vegan. I can't even begin to do anything but recommend it as the number one most best decision I ever made in my life, bar none. A close second would be marrying my beautiful wife, Madeline, I guess. But so it's been really an enormous gift to me in my life, and so I just feel duty bound to spread this message, because not only are we have much more energy and feel much more healthy, I think, as a vegans, but the amount of violence that radiates from our lives into the world really reduces. And if we look at the violence that we cause animals, it's not just a little bit, it's really an enormous amount of violence. And we have whole armies of our brothers and sisters who we pay, if I'm buying cheese or fish or hot dogs or hamburgers, to do that violence that I probably wouldn't want to do myself, not to the extent of the amount of meat we eat in this country. We eat a lot of meat. and dairy products and eggs. So it takes a lot of people to confine the animals and to drug the animals and to transport them and to stab them and to mutilate them and do all these things. And if you do any research on the lives of these people, and it's coming out, here and there in the press, there are books on it as well. In my book, the World Peace Diet, I have a chapter on this, on the workers. And I think it's Martin Luther King said, violence anywhere hurts everyone everywhere. We are all interconnected. And I think that's a very important point that we tend in our culture to neglect, understanding that we're all interconnected on this planet. And so if we have industries where we pay people to do things that bring out the worst in them, where they're forced to desensitize themselves and really dehumanize themselves by stabbing and mutilating animals and harming them over and over and over again. And then if you just look at the statistics of the workers and how they have much higher suicide, drug addiction, alcoholism, spouse abuse, child abuse, crime rates, I mean, we create whole pockets in our culture of violence and misery, and we're very naive to think that we can force our brothers and sisters to do this kind of horrific work and that it doesn't affect us. It does affect us. And so that's just one dimension of the whole thing. We also have, and we'll talk about it later, we have a lot of starvation and hunger in the world while we're growing massive amounts of grain that could feed them. And then the other thing I think that my book really focuses on, the World Peace Diet focuses on, is just the underlying mentality that's required by our meals. And I'll maybe just talk about this a little bit for a few minutes and then kind of wrap it up and turn it over to Farmer Harold Brown. But the mentality that's required by our meals, if you think about it a little bit, and I have this in the first few chapters of the World Peace Diet, it's a mentality that's actually injected into each and every one of us by our culture, and especially by our culture's meals. And if we want to live lives where we can make a difference for peace, sustainability, justice, equality, freedom, beauty, joy, I think we have to look at our cultural conditioning and the fundamental core of our culture. And so the basic idea really is that we've all been raised in a culture that has this hidden core that's a taboo to talk about, and that core is the mentality that we see on our plate 3 times a day, and that is required by us in order to actually have that food on our plate. And that mentality has a few characteristics. I'll just go through them quickly. The basic one, that's sort of the essential characteristic of the mentality of our culture, is that it is a mentality of reduction, of reductionism. And we tend to create reductionist science, reductionist religion, a whole education is reductionist. We tend to, and the core of it is reducing beings to things, to commodities. So it's a mentality of commodification of life. Whenever we commodify someone, and turn a someone into a something, then we not only harm them, and we can't avoid harming them. Just the very act of doing that is an act of violence. As soon as I do that in my mind, I'm violating the integrity and the sacredness of another living being. And so, but we're all forced into this by our culture. We're forced into the mentality of learning to look. We just practice this over and over and over again. That's like I do with that chicken. It's just a thing. You just kill it, eat it, and so that hardens our hearts at a very fundamental, deep level beyond what anyone can even talk about. So what I'm talking about right now, I'm actually talking about the biggest taboo, I believe, in our culture. This is the thing that nobody wants to talk about. What is the mentality that's required by our meals? Mentality of reductionism, of commodification, and of exclusion. We learn to exclude certain beings from the sphere of our compassion. We practice that at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day in and day out. Madeline, what's the old German word? Saying? Übung macht den Meister. Practice makes the master. Practice makes perfect. We keep practicing. The other thing is it's disconnectedness. We practice disconnecting the reality on our plate from the reality that it took to get it onto our plate. So, as a culture, if we want to be agents of positive change, if we want to somehow contribute something to the evolution of our culture and to help, in some way move our culture be out of what I think really we all feel is, in a sense, a very dark age of war and incredibly foolhardy decimation of the environment. I mean, we're just absolutely devastating the oceans, the rainforests, the entire landmass. We're in the middle of the largest extinction of species that the world has seen. Bigger than the last one 65 million years ago. It's enormous. I just read it 2 days ago that the top biologists say that in our lifetimes we'll lose 50% of all the species on the planet. I mean, this is a wake-up call of the biggest order. So we're not going to be able to just tweak things a little bit here and there. We need to have a major change, a major transformation. And I think it needs to start not only on our plates, but more essentially in the mentality that's required to get the food that we're eating onto our plates, which is, like I said, a mentality of disconnectedness, of exclusion, and of reduction and commodification, and also of predation, that we're essentially predatory, that we're predators by nature. Because as soon as we lose our mother's breast, and the first, if we're lucky enough to get that, we get milk, some kind of dairy, some kind of whatever you get. I don't know what you get nowadays, but it's some kind of formula. But anyway, then you start eating. They start giving you this the baby food, these little jars, and just go to the store and look what's in those little baby jars. Little hot dogs, little hamburgers, little roast beef chunks, little turkey, chicken, fish, cheese. The little kids, I mean, we get that forced into us, and so we're taught at the core of our being by the people we trust the most, our mothers, our doctors, the ministers, everybody, the media, that we're essentially predatory, that we have this eye that wants to look, to harm, to damage, to use, to kill for my benefit. This is the absolute opposite of the fundamental teaching of every religion, of every spiritual tradition. Every spiritual tradition, the whole idea is to try to cultivate the part of ourselves that has a sense of benevolence and kindness and tenderness and mercy for others. Anyone who is a predator vis-a-vis humans, we lock them up as psychopaths and sociopaths. They terrify us. And yet we're all, basically, we have this predatory economic system, we have this predatory mentality towards nature, towards many animals. And again, it comes, I believe, from the programming that we are absolutely is injected into us at the deepest level by the routine of our culture and the meals that come from our parents, and it was forced into them by their parents, and it was forced into them by their parents, and it goes back only 8,000 years, between 8 and 10,000 years, so it's basically relatively new. So I think I'm getting to the point where I need to turn it over to Harold here. Double check here on the time. Yes. So these are just some opening comments that try to look deeply into what our culture, the programming of our culture, and then to see all of the ramifications that radiate from that in so many different ways. This is an adventure of a lifetime. I mean, really, this is, I think, when we start to look at the ramifications of our food choices, we will see not the pathway to an enormously benevolent and positive liberation. So I want to just thank all of you for making it here, and I'd like to introduce my colleague Harold Brown, who's originally from Michigan and now flew in from Ithaca, New York. And there's a nice little thing right on this sheet here. Did everyone get this or no? Not everyone got it. It's okay. So, just so I can show you how good my eyes are here. Harold Brown, also known as Farmer Brown, was born and raised on a cattle farm in south central Michigan and spent over half his life in agriculture as a beef cattle farmer, including 3 years in the dairy industry. Harold is featured in the Tribe of Heart documentary Peaceful Kingdom and The Journey Home. His story is one of transformation from animal farmer to vegan animal advocate. He also works as an advocate for animal rights, sustainable independent family farms, environmental justice, social justice, and peace through nonviolence. Let's have a big hand for Harold Brown.
Thank you, Will. And like you say, you shouldn't applaud for somebody until you've heard what they got to say. Well, you're in a place and a time where you're going to be challenged on a few things. Because like Will was talking about, This is about indoctrination. It's questioning our indoctrination. Where did I come from? You probably, are there any ag students in here or farmers in here? You should. Don't be afraid. We're not going to bite. We're vegans. We don't, flesh does not pass our lips. None? Okay. Well, the story about, you probably wonder anyway, how does a person go from being a cattle farmer, somebody who worked in the dairy industry, and spent so many years in that culture, become a vegan animal rights activist? Well, that's a story for tomorrow night. So you have to come back. But tonight's topic is about agriculture and the environment. Now, this is something I'm pretty familiar with, and on the grounds, boots on the ground, familiar with too. Because in New York, I work with citizens who have filed suits against CAFOs about environmental damage. And the things I've seen are absolutely horrific. But in a general sense, what we see with agriculture in the United States, and particularly, and since basically 1950, but it really accelerated from about 1980 on, with what's called the Green Revolution. How many people know that term, Green Revolution? Well, for those of you who don't, it's an Orwellian term because it was real good use. Green Revolution doesn't have anything to do with anything green. It's chemical agriculture, born out of the Second World War. And we're globalizing it. It's a method of agriculture that we're taking worldwide to support the mantra of the Green Revolution, to feed a hungry world. That used to flow from my lips so easily. It doesn't anymore. Because there's consequences. But there's far-ranging consequences because, as Will was talking about, I think in a broader perspective, and I want to challenge you on this, I submit to you this idea, you might think, well, this reductionist way of viewing it, and that we all are part of this, we all have this view of the world. Well, you do, and here's a word that kind of we all use, but really think deeply about this. When we talk about anything out in nature, we talk about it as resources. Here, and we have a representative from this department, the Department of Natural Resources. Now, what's the definition of a resource? It's something to be controlled, managed, and used. Right? We all agree on that? Shake your head. Yeah. Okay. We all agree on that. Well, that's a form of violence in and of itself. Because it doesn't acknowledge any resource. It doesn't have to be nature. It can be anything that's considered a resource as having any innate value in and of itself, and that it has any sort of homeostasis in and of itself. We look at it as something that has to be used. Now, I went to a land-grant college. I went to Michigan State University, which is what you guys are, land-grant school. And when you're in agriculture, the one thing there's a deep psychology that runs through it, but it's not explicit in your education, but it is inherent in your education and in your programming. And this deep psychology comes down to a pretty simple world perspective, and that is that the nature is chaos, and our responsibility, our obligation as agriculturalists, is to bring order to the chaos, to bend nature to our will. And since the 90s, we've gotten really good with that. With our biotech sciences, we have gotten exceedingly good at bending nature to our will, or re-engineering nature to our will. And I'm not just talking about seeds, GMOs. I'm talking about animals, too. We've always been good at selectively breeding animals, but we're going the next step with that. And while it's not really on the radar screen here in the United States, it will be real soon. The technology's been hammered out in the UK, and it'll be here real soon. And again, this is something that's more in the realm of the ethical, moral concern of animals, and would be more appropriate for tomorrow night. So if you come back, remind me, and I'll tell you the story. No, you got to come back so you can remind me and tell you the story. But what are the consequences of agriculture on the environment? Well, industrialized agriculture, I don't call it farming. To me, I grew up on an independent family farm. All the farms around us were owned by my great uncles. One was a sheep farmer, one was a dairy farmer, we were beef farmers. And we were also all crop farmers up in south central Michigan. And farming to me is a sacred relationship with the land. We don't have that sacred relationship. An interesting thing is to look at Cornell University, which is one of the weirdest land grants you'll ever walk into because it's an Ivy League college too. And I'll tell you, you walk into Ithaca and it's like, it's strange. But Ezra Cornell, who founded Cornell University, he wrote something and gave a little talk once called The Sacred Earth. And he talked explicitly about the sacredness of our relationship to the earth and to the food and to nature. And now you look at Cornell University, and they're very much into chemical agriculture. They're very much into the biotech sciences and animal life sciences. And it's about altering nature to our will. In New York, you may not know, we are the second largest dairy producing state in the United States. California's number one, we're number two. We have some very large mega dairies. So we have these industrialized dairy farms dotting the countryside. The consequences of these, and here you predominantly have hog farms. And the consequences are pretty much the same. Because what you're doing is you're putting lots of animals into one spot, and on average, farm animals in the United States create 131 times more excrement than humans do per day. That's a lot of poop. Well, it's funny how in cities we require waste treatment plants, right? To clean up our mess. We don't on farms. We see it, they call it nutrients. You don't call it manure, you call it nutrients. And you spread those nutrients out on fields to amend the soil, to enrichment. And there's problems in this system because most everybody uses what's called liquid manure management, which is basically the animals are kept inside nearly their whole lives. And then you, like in a dairy system, you wash it down, there's scrapers that scrape out the alleys, and it goes down a tube out into a lagoon, or a holding pond, they like to call them. They don't like calling them lagoons anymore. Or they call them aerobic digesters, or anaerobic digesters. But they're the ponds. They're these big ponds, you guys have seen them here. And then eventually trucks are brought out, we call them hoolies, that's just the name of a company that builds them. And they pump this liquid manure and urine in there and water, and they go out and spray it on the fields or inject it in the fields. Well, for most of these operations, to be profitable relies on how many animals you have. Well, since you can put a lot of animals in a small footprint, you can keep adding barns. Like in dairies, you can keep adding barns, and you can build lagoons. And it doesn't require a lot of space, but you're getting more and more and more manure. So even though these CAFOs have to apply for permits for spreading it, and then in most states they have to file what's called a BMP, or Best Management Practice, with the state too, that has plat maps of all the fields and how they're going to spread it when. There's also regulations on that too. Like you can't spray manure 24 hours either side of a hydrological event, that means rain or snow. So if it rains and you spread 24 hours beforehand or 24 hours after that, and God forbid during it, then you're in violation of it and there's supposed to be a fine. In the state of New York, there's never been a fine. In the state of Michigan, there's never been a fine to a farmer for doing that. But they do it. And they do it all the time. This one dairy that's north of Ithaca is the largest dairy. They claim to be the largest dairy east of the Mississippi. And on their website, they claim to have 16,200 cows in production. And it's a massive. They have satellites of this thing all over the area. And I got roped into this originally because I'm licensed with the state of New York as a Class CD water operator. I can run a municipal water system. So I got brought into this to do water sampling so it satisfied the chain of custody for the water sampling that was done by the lab for their lawsuit. Well, in the last 4 years, I've gotten to know these people pretty well. I've met the people who both work on this industrialized farm, and I've met the people who own it. And it is a really interesting dynamic. And when you don't think that there isn't a dynamic of otherness and violence with these people, there is. The people who own this operation see their neighbors as the others. They see them as collateral damage to supplying cheap food to America. And unfortunately, in New York, we have what's called the DEC, which is like your DNR, and the Department of Health, and Ag and Markets, and unfortunately our Attorney General all see it the same way. And our federal courts in Western New York also see it that way. Because they went to court a year ago, it went into federal court, it went into the appeals court this year, and in both times it got thrown out. But let me tell you what's happened to these people. Fred is a guy who lives just south of the old Maine milking barns, and just up the road from their heifer replacement operation. Fred's 82 years old now. If you meet Fred, he looks kind of weird. He's just up this tall, white hair and stuff, and he was a beef farmer. But he looks kind of weird, because when you look at him, something's really strange about his eyes. Well, because of the hydrogen sulfide in the air, it constantly was irritating the tear ducts in his eyes, especially his lower lids. And they were constantly getting infected, and he was getting styes and infecting the styes. And the doctors eventually surgically removed the edge of both lower eyelids. And now he doesn't get any infections anymore. But that's just from living it. A few years ago, his wife died from drinking the water from their well. Because when we did sampling on the well water there, the E. coli in his well is so high that the lab had to cut the water sample by 50% to even count the E. coli. And it killed his wife. So when I met Fred, I met him after his wife had passed, I said, Fred, what keeps you here? Both your daughters have left. What keeps you on this piece of land? He says, my family has been farming on this piece of land since 1782. And I'll be damned if I'm going to have any 20-year-old industrialized farm push me off my land. Well, he used to raise beef cattle, and we had that in common. I asked him, well, how come you don't have beef cows anymore? He said, well, the main reason was a few years ago, he said they were getting sick. He said they ate well, they drank well, but they weren't gaining weight. Well, the most common thing we look at in cows when that happens is something called Yanni's disease. So Cornell came up, took blood tests, and none of his cows had Yanni's. They had E. coli. It was so high in their digestive tract. But see, it's interesting because his beef cows are all pasture beef cows. He never grained his beef cows. Now that form of E. coli that kills people, it was on the lettuce last year out of California, and so on, that form of E. coli, there are many strains of E. coli. Urinary tract infections are a form of E. coli. But that particular E. coli that kills us only comes from one place in nature. It comes from the digestive tract of ruminant animals on a grain diet. Because cows are pure herbivores. They were never meant to eat grain. And when you feed them grain, it causes acidosis in their digestive tract, and it's a breeding ground for that type of E. coli. So we've got an aquifer that runs under this farm and its neighbors that's contaminated with E. coli to the point that it's lethal. So, needless to say, they don't do that. They can't use their streams for recreation. There's just a few, I shouldn't call them streams, they're really creeks that just run through their farms. But they can't use them for much of anything. You can't fish in them because there aren't any fish. There's crawdads and other things in them, and frogs. But everybody looks at what's going on around them and they say, oh my God. But the worst thing is the air. The worst thing is the air. Now there's a family that lives just north of the Maine milking barns, and I just talked to Connie earlier today. Now they were an interesting kind of study in all of this, because there's Connie, her son Sam, and that doesn't work, her son, and then her husband Scott. Well, they became like this little case study for the scientists, because Connie was a school teacher, and then eventually she had to quit teaching school because her short-term memory was gone. But she was also having other problems. At least Sam and her were having problems with constant nasal irritation, upper respiratory problems, bloody noses without warning. They would get memory problems, but for her short-term memory was getting so bad that she was a school teacher. She was bringing homework home to correct and grade, and she wasn't doing it. And she'd get back to school and go, oh crap. And just everything started going away for her, so she had to quit teaching. And for Sam, having the benefit of a teacher as a mother, he did well in school. He had a built-in tutor. He was in gifted programs until 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, he ended up in the learning disabled program. So in the course of the discovery process of this lawsuit, they brought in 2 neurologists, one from New York City, one from California, to study the people in this suit, but in particular this family. Because the one thing was, the husband Scott, he doesn't have any problems at all, except when he's there too long. He does get bloody noses, and he has the respiratory problems. So they looked at him, and they found that the hydrogen sulfide content in their bodies for Connie and Sam were off the charts. But for Scott, it was negligible. The reason being, because he worked for a telecommunications company, he was only home on Sundays for the last 12, 13 years. So the concentration was much lower in his body. But Sam, unfortunately, is never going to get better. Now, they moved a year and a half ago. They moved away from this area, away from this CAFO, to be able to breathe fresh air. Because the biggest problem Sam would have, started 3 years ago, is he had a bunch of chickens and ducks. They have a 10-acre farm. And then when he went out to take care, after school, to take care of them, if he was out there for like an hour, he would collapse. His legs wouldn't work. His motor skills for his legs were gone. They'd bring him in the house, half hour, 45 minutes later, he could walk again. And then that time frame got shorter and shorter, so if he was out for 15 minutes, he would collapse. So, red flag, we got to get out of here. They got out of there, and he can walk okay. I won't get into how the violence of this extends into the community, because they've got their problems there too, because they've been told by the local fire department and the ambulance that if they ever need them, don't count on them, because everybody that works for our fire barns in our area are all volunteer, and all the volunteers work for this dairy. And they basically say, you're making trouble for our boss. If you need our help, we're not going to be there. So the violence radiates out beyond purely environmental, purely against the animals. It goes to people too. It's an interesting thing that we, when I've looked at the environmental impacts of what's going on, and then look nationally, I've gotten involved, somewhat with Sierra Club, but with other groups, to see what the impact is. And it's usually a 20-year window that these CAFOs have before they're up against the wall, environmentally. And at that point, it's either they buy out their neighbors, which allows them to keep expanding, buy out their neighbors, or they move. This happened over by Buffalo, New York. There was a dairy over there that was also, on top of all the other environmental problems that they create, was taking all of this, they're called split out cows. Dairy cows give so darn much milk, we push them so hard to give milk that they develop osteoporosis, and the real common problem is having a hip fracture. And when that happens, they do the splits with the rear legs. It's called splitting out. So you put them in the loader with the tractor, you take them out and dump them. Well, they were taking their cows out because I found like this open graveyard. They were just dumping them on the ground, right next to a lagoon and right next to a spring-fed pond. And I went around, was picking up skulls and looking at the skulls, and they never shot one of these cows. They just took them out alive and left them to die. You know, it's like, to me, even back in the day, I wouldn't have done that to a cow. But the thing is now you've got not only this lagoon that they put in was illegal, they put it over the township line, and that was illegal, but it was leaching into this pond, which fed into a stream, which went into Lake Ontario, because you could stand in their cornfield and you could see the sea, on a clear day you can see the CN Tower in Toronto. But when it rains, they have video, the people who live right on the lake, there's some very nice homes, right on the lake, they're like $500,000 homes. They've taken video footage of when it rains, this manure, which is, they don't follow the BMP. What they do, it's a disposal problem for them. So they're applying it to their fields, not at agronomic rates, they're applying it at disposal rates. Because when I went out in that one cornfield, it was early spring and the stubble was about yay high, and I kicked into it, the manure was about 6 inches deep. And when it rains, there's this strip from this one creek east, it turns Lake Ontario brown, about 50 yards out and down. There's a state park down the road. I drove down there and asked the park rangers, I said, when it rains, what do you have to do here? You know, I didn't set him up, I just want to know, is there anything you have to do if it rains here? He said, oh yeah, we shut down the beach and the boat launch, because we can't even let people wade in the water because the manure is so thick. I'm going, you gotta be kidding me. I said, no. He says, we shut down the park when it rains. And it takes at least 24 to 48 hours for it to clear out. These are not isolated instances. This is all across America. In southern Michigan, northern Ohio, and Indiana, these mega dairies have been building at a breakneck pace, particularly by a corporation out of Holland called Riverhoff. And they come in and contract farmers who are on the edge, and they buy up derelict farms and open up these dairies. And the environmental consequences, especially in southern Michigan, is terrible. And if you want to see how bad it is, you can go on the Sierra Club website in Michigan, and it's on their website. They have a 20-minute DVD that's streamed online, so you can see just how bad it is. And they have a local doctor who talks about what it's done to his patients. In our area, this particular dairy north of Ithaca, I went up and I interviewed, videotaped one family. They have a teenage daughter. She just graduated from high school last year. She was on the track team. And it got so long that it's so bad up there that their distance runners, their milers, and their cross-country teams cannot compete anymore. Because if they try to do a mile on the track, they can't make it. It's like their lungs shut down. They showed pictures. She showed me videotape of the girls running on the track, and they get about 3 laps into it, and they look like chronic smokers. They're bent over, they're breathing, sometimes they're spitting up blood. And so they've had to completely take their distance running and their cross-country out of the mix in their district competitions because the air is so foul that they breathe every day during their training. These are the consequences. The consequences are horrendous against our natural resources that we manage. And we try to manage this too, and we do a terrible job at it. But on the other hand, it's the consequences to humans, the violence towards humans, is unbelievable. Unless you're out there and you're on the ground talking to these people, you really don't see it. So I think we're going to have a chance for Q&A later, right?
Right.
Sorry. Okay.
Thank you so much. The program here is we will now hear from Dr. Clark Ford. Then we'll have a short break where we have some refreshments, and then we'll come back, I'll speak, and then we'll have a panel discussion with Craig. We'll have your chance for questions and answers, and then we'll have the wrap-up. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Clark Ford to you, and he has a BA in biology from the University of California, LA, and a master's in botany and a PhD in genetics from the University of Iowa. He's a professor in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at Iowa State University. He's doing research on quality protein maize to enhance human nutrition in the developing world. Teaches a class on world hunger. Let's hear it for Clark Ford. Thank you.
This projector warms up. I have slides, and I apologize for that. I have a lot of slides, but I plan to stay in my 10. I'll be right back. I'm just waiting for the projector to warm up. This is actually going to happen. I'd like to expand this discussion globally now. And, the bad news about the environment is that globally, animal agriculture is a huge problem. Some estimates would. I need this, huh? Some estimates would indicate that with all told, animal agriculture is responsible for 18% of global warming, for example, which is more than cars and buses and trains put together. So, of course, there has been massive environmental damage to the water, to the soils, to the rainforests around the world due to animal agriculture. But my topic is world hunger and animal agriculture. And so, since I have so much in here, I think it's time to begin. Now, I'd like to start off talking about history. We'll start with the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago with the domestication of plants and animals, and this really gave rise to huge population growths, as you can see. The human population produced culture and technology, and because they were settled and not nomadic like hunters and gatherers were, and their populations grew, pretty soon they needed more food. In order to get more food, they had to go out and conquer their neighbors. And so this is the violence inherent in the system, as Monty Python would say. And so conquest for land has been a big part of the agricultural cycle. And as this has gone on for 10,000 years, we have had expanding populations which have gotten monumental just in the last couple of hundred years, but also with a huge human population, then environmental destruction. And part of that environmental destruction would be due to animal agriculture. Now, the big 5 domesticated animals were not equally distributed around the world. They're in Eurasia. And so Eurasia, that continent of Asia and Europe, had the most successful agriculture, not just the plants, with wheat in the Middle East and rice in the rest of Asia, but also these domesticated animals, the horse, cow, pig, sheep, and goat. And they contributed then to the dominance of Eurasia in terms of populations, and then, of course, a later conquest of other continents. Now, what is the advantage of an agricultural animal to an agricultural society? Well, meat, of course, traction to pull plows and carts. War dominance. The horse was the most important vehicle of warfare. And humans spent 10,000 years fighting each other in agricultural societies. Furs and fiber, fertilizer, germs. Humans living in close association with their agricultural animals picked up those diseases. They became epidemic diseases for humans, wiped out vast numbers. But the people doing that also became resistant. When they came to the New World, they brought those diseases, and the natives in the New World had never seen them before. And so these diseases, which originated from agricultural animals, then are thought to have wiped out up to 95% of the Native Americans, for example. Now, how does an agricultural society work? As I said, it's based on, a big part of it is based on conquest and extracting resources from this land that you have conquered. And of course, here we are in Iowa in a conquered land, so it's a perfect example of how that system works. So you see, for 10,000 years, not so much here in Iowa, the people that are conquered are left in place to produce food, right? They're the conquered and exploited. They become the peasants, the slaves, the workers, and they are the poor. And so this is a pyramid of population, vast numbers of poor whose work and the food that they produce go to small numbers of elite who are wealthy and well-fed, and of course, eat more meat. Now, all of this society works by the interaction of the government, religion, and the economy. And in agricultural societies, the economy literally was an economy of conquest, as well as, of course, growing food. The government needed to organize that, and they were very closely associated with the religions, which for all the years before the religions Will was talking about, these were meat redistribution religions, where meat was grown, brought to the temple, sacrificed to the gods, and then redistributed to the people. Okay? And again, violence inherent in the system for thousands of years of our agricultural societies. And meat is the most prestigious food of agricultural society. So there's, of course, a religious justification of how this system works. It was seen to be blessed by the divine. Now, here we are in 2008 with over 6 billion people in the world, and you can see that Eurasia has the vast majority of people, especially in the Indian subcontinent and in East Asia of China, and Europe has a vast number of people also. But this is not necessarily where the wealth is concentrated. And so vast numbers of people doesn't mean that there's vast amounts of food for everybody. The other revolution that has impacted agricultural societies is the Industrial Revolution. And this graph really shows the difference between wealth around the world in 1820, those light gray bars, pretty evenly distributed. And then in the 200 years since, the effect of industrialization has led to massive amounts of inequity, where the countries of Western Europe, Japan, the colonies of Northern Europe and the United States and Canada have amassed a massive amount of wealth and ownership of the resources of the rest of the world. We remember that in the 1800s, Africa was almost entirely partitioned by European powers to extract wealth. And so here we have a current map of global incomes. You can see that Europe, which became dominant starting in about the 1500s, and it's the northern European colonies are the wealthiest, the United States and Australia. Japan also adopted the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. Now, what about the poor countries? What about the poor countries? Many people believe that for them to catch up, they are going to have to adopt more industrialization. That is the future. And that's certainly been what's happening in China. and more in India. So that demographers tell us that by 2050, the economy of China will or surpass that of the United States, as will the economy of India be equal to or surpass that of the United States. So the world is changing. Now here's food consumption, which you can see tracks wealth almost identically. And we have huge parts of Africa and the subcontinent of India, South Asia, which are ranking very low there in food consumption. So ultimately, the inverse of that map, the world hunger map, you can see sub-Saharan Africa is desperately poor and has a lot of problems. AIDS, malaria, poor or no roads, poor or little education, poor agriculture, low amounts of fertilizer. The list goes on and on and on. Little irrigation for sub-Saharan Africa. So this number changes, and it's gotten worse recently just because of the advent of biofuels in the last year and poor crops and increasing amounts of meat being eaten in the world. But a number 850 to 950 million people are undernourished. And of course, being undernourished is a huge problem in their lives. So this is called chronic undernutrition, and the cause is essentially directly related to poverty, extreme poverty, as we'll see. So there are many statistics. Over 20,000 people die each day due to causes related to undernutrition. But one of the things that sort of strikes my students in our world hunger class is that 3/4 of the people dying from hunger are children under the age of 5. And that seems to be a huge moral problem. I mean, we would never want the children in our lives, our own children, to be dying at this rate. So how come this is morally acceptable? How do they die? Well, in red you can see just the effect of undernutrition, neonatal disorders, diarrhea, pneumonia, malaria, etc. 200 million children are stunted. That is, they have a low height for their age. And again, it's the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and some in Central and South America. 150 million children are underweight, low weight for their age. Again, sub-Saharan Africa, but the biggest problem in South Asia. So poverty is a cause of hunger. There's almost half the world's population earns less than $2 a day. And of course, what can you do with that? And yet, 1.2 billion people are in extreme poverty, earning less than $1 a day. Now, 75% of these live in rural areas, so it's a very different rural picture globally than it is here in Iowa. The poor live in rural areas. But that doesn't mean that they own land. They're just poor and rural. And the worst is in sub-Saharan Africa. So this graph indicates where the poor were in 1981 in the gray, and you can see East Asia, or China, was the biggest bar. And then in the dark, 2001. So the economic boom in East China in the last 20 years has drastically reduced poverty and hunger. But in those last 20 years, sub-Saharan Africa has increased in poverty and hunger. So we know that wealthy countries consume more meat per capita. Here's the United States topping the chart, Europe very high, China big, all bigger than the global average, India very low, and other less developed nations extremely low. And the other chart then tracks the meat consumption per person versus their per capita income. And so, of course, countries with large per capita income have the highest meat consumption. And here we have a graph of meat consumption, which pretty much tracks what we saw with wealth. Right? The hash marks indicate that 20 or more percent of the people in those countries are undernourished. So the wealthy are able to outcompete the poor for food. They purchase more livestock. The herd becomes more dependent on grain. The price of grain goes up, and it's harder for the poor to buy grain. Add biofuels onto this, and that's a real problem for the poor in the world. Now, interestingly, though, the situation in the developing world is changing. It's radically changing. And this has been called not the Green Revolution, but the livestock revolution. I'll talk about that more, but here you can begin to see, here it's 1980, a few years after Diet for a Small Planet was written, the annual meat consumption in developing countries is very low. It has doubled the 1980 level. Whereas developed countries haven't changed very much. And yet, of course, the meat consumption in developing countries is much lower than in developed countries. But the total meat consumption, because remember, the vast majority of the world's population lives in developing countries. The total meat consumption is higher, actually, in developing countries than in the developed world. And that's a big change from 20 years ago. So here we can see that most meat is produced in developing countries now. Here the dark bar is developing countries. Starting in 1970, meat production was low, and now it's higher than in the developed world. On the other side, we have milk production, and milk has always been higher in the developed countries, but you can see that dark bar is rising fast, so the developing countries are increasing milk production also. Where is meat produced in the world? China. Okay? Because of their huge population. But the meat eaten in China is mostly eaten in the urban areas. So the consumption in the urban areas is 3 times what it is in the rural areas of China. Okay? The USA is second, Brazil third, etc. And then those are all Western countries. Now, the world population has been growing, and the blue here indicates developed countries. You can see they're at zero population growth. So the growth in world population starting in 1950 here and to the arrow, which is where we are currently, has all been in the developing world in yellow and will continue to be there. However, and this is driven by poverty. People have children because it's their only source of wealth. But in the developed world, where there was industrial wealth, then and increased health care and education, then population rates have been zero for a number of years. And that's happening in the rest of the world. Demographic transition is occurring in the developing world. There should be zero population growth sometime around 2050. There also will be more people, there already are more people living in urban areas than rural around the world, but that's a recent shift. 5 minutes. Okay. And increased industrialization. Well, global incomes are rising. And global incomes are rising in developing countries, so that means they're going to be eating more meat. Right? I'm going to skip this slide, but essentially, people in the developing countries, of course, are eating about 12.5% of their diet as meat. People in the developed world are eating about 27% of their calories as meat. And so there is a huge discrepancy, and of course, you could say there was a huge moral problem there. But calorie consumption is increasing. Here's the people with the lowest calorie consumption, and that is decreased since 1964. Here's people at the highest level, 3,000 plus calories a day, and you can see that that's projected to increase straight up. So the world is going to be growing more food, and people are going to be eating better. In fact, a big problem then is overnutrition in the world. And of course, it's the wealthy countries right now that are suffering the most. However, there is overnutrition also in the developing world. Here's the least developed countries. The underweight people are, of course, a much higher level than the overweight in green. But, and of course, the developed countries have a much bigger problem with overweight versus underweight. But it is getting worse even in developing countries. Here's a graph showing underweight and overweight side by side in the populations of many developing countries: Peru, Tunisia, Colombia, Brazil, Costa Rica, Cuba, Morocco, Chile, Mexico. Those are the top ones on that list, with huge amounts of overweight people. Overweight. So global meat consumption is rising and will continue to rise. And the white zones there indicate the amount of increased demand between now and 2050. As I said, the livestock revolution is now increasing the amount of animal agriculture in the world. And you can see the developing world is going to get the lion's share of that. Where is that happening? China. Okay? LA is Latin America up there in yellow. The little gray bar is sub-Saharan Africa. They're not going to be getting as much. So China leads the world in meat production. It's number one in pork, mutton, eggs, number one in aquaculture, number two in poultry, number three in beef, and of course the meat of choice is pork. Here we have global hog production, and there's China over there, one of the ground zeros for hog production. Also ground zero for aquaculture. China, by far, by an order of magnitude, more intense aquaculture than other countries in the world. India is the world's top milk producer. Okay? But poultry meat is increasing in the diet. Here's the increase in poultry in India. And here's poultry globally, and you can see India, China, Europe, South America are huge in chickens. Here is a map of livestock just in the tropical regions. And you can see India very big, but also sub-Saharan Africa, big in Brazil. Brazil is the number one place for cattle in the world, followed by India. So there's 1.3 billion cattle. That number is projected to double by 2050. And animals are used in agriculture. Half of the world's ag land is farmed with animals. So I think I can say that in Africa they're importing meat. Brazil is exporting meat. The United States is the number one exporter, but we're exporting not to developing countries, but to our wealthy trading partners, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Canada. Here's pork going to Japan, Mexico, Canada, etc. Animal feed. We know that a lot of the livestock production is not grazing, but actually dependent on feed. That's what we grow here in Iowa, is animal feed. Our corn and beans are primarily for livestock. And you can see that animal feed is increasing in the world. 40% of global grain production is just for animals. Do you need me to stop now?
Well, if they're going to keep on the track.
I have
How you
about
doing?
5 more minutes.
Sorry, just can go over.
All right, we're going over. In the pink here, this is pig feed. A huge portion of that is China. China is an agricultural colossus in the world. In the United States, we're kind of used to thinking of China, I don't know, as this third world country. I'm sorry, China has the most people in the world, will have the biggest economy, and certainly has the biggest agriculture. Now, in the United States, most of our corn is fed to animals. Most of our corn is fed to animals. Actually, most of our soybeans are fed to animals, and here's where it goes. 50% to poultry, 25% to swine, 12% to beef. Now, David Pimental has said, if all the grain currently fed to livestock in the United States were consumed directly by people, the number of people who could be fed would be nearly 800 million. And there have been variants of this claim. And I think that it points out that the wealthy countries are cobbing off with huge amounts of agricultural resources and using them for the animal production. However, the problem is that if all the grain currently fed to livestock in the United States were not fed to livestock, then the price would go down, the amount produced would go down, and in fact that grain would not necessarily be available to feed people in the developing world. Not only that, but it would be unethical to dump that grain on people in the developing world, because many of the poorest are farmers themselves, and they could not absorb free grain being delivered to their country. How could they survive and compete with that? So there are a lot of problems in dealing with this. And that's basically what this slide says. And I'd just like to close. I had the opportunity to meet Tom Regan, who's a philosopher. He's the author of A Case for Animal Rights. He is an advocate of the production of meat substitutes in order to save animals, of course, but also to, in sort of a practical way, try to transition people or wean them off of meats and to plant-derived foods. So I'm done. Thank you.
Ed, thank you so much. All right, so we are really blessed, I think, to have this outpouring of information and ideas. And the schedule at this point is for us to take a much-needed, I think, stretch and break. And Gaurav, do we have some refreshments ready for everyone, I think? Yeah. Okay, so basically, we'll take a short break, 10 minutes. I'm happy to sign books if you're interested. We'll take, use the restrooms if you need to. We have some food in the back. It's all vegan food and specially prepared for us. And we'll come back in about 10 minutes and we'll continue our discussion. We'll have the question and answer as well. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. I'd like to jump right in here to the second part after the first part we just had with Clark and Harold. I'm going to give a short talk myself, and we're going to open it up for questions to all three of us. Okay, so I think it was really interesting to have the ideas that we just got, the on the ground direct understanding that Harold has gotten about the devastating effects of pollution, and I think the feeling I had, and I think probably all of us, he was just basically scratching the surface of the problem of toxins that are caused by animal production. And in the World Peace Diet, I have in here a whole sort of interconnected range of ideas that in the short amount of time that we have now, I'd like to try to weave in here. And we heard from Clark about the global understanding of food and how animal production, eating meat, is using a huge amount of land as well. And so what I'd like to just talk about actually is another dimension, and we'll probably be going into this more during the questions and maybe tomorrow as well, but some of the other types of implications, and they're really important for us, I think, to understand. The environmental implications are massive, and we still, I think, have barely scratched the surface of them. We've heard a little bit about the global warming and just the basic fact that feeding huge amounts of grain to animals takes an enormous amount of petroleum, takes an enormous amount of land, takes an enormous amount of habitat that could go to wildlife, and wildlife is being decimated. It causes an enormous amount of pollution. And the products that are gotten from that concentrate toxins, all these pesticides that are sprayed on the fields that eventually end up in the water also end up in our bodies. They end up in the bodies of fish, especially. And I think, honestly, when you really go into this in depth, and I have in the World Peace Diet, there's an entire chapter called Profiting from Destruction that goes into the whole multifaceted dilemma of the environmental devastation caused by killing animals for food and feeding them. The population explosion on this planet of humans is really small compared to the population explosion on this planet of livestock, of animals that we're killing for food. And when you look, I think, in depth at this whole system and see not only the enormous amount of feces and urine that are produced, as Harold said, 130 times the human population, it's not only more toxic, it's not only more quantity, but it's more toxic. And I think anyone knows if you go to build a house, all the strict rules about a septic tank and so forth, there's just none of that for farms. And so, so much of this ends up in the water. And I think it's important. There's a chapter in the book, also, The World Peace Diet, about aquaculture and the animals that live in the waters, and what we're doing when we eat fish. We're eating the concentrated toxins. Everything that comes off of the land ends up in the water, ends up in the flesh of fish. And I've seen aquaculture operations too, and I think it's really remarkable to see these places, because I've seen some inside, some outside ones, and the water is totally black. I remember just thinking there's nothing there, it's just black water. And then I realized the fish were just crammed in there. It was full of fish, and they were swimming in black water. It was black because it was their own feces. And the workers were dumping in antibiotics and other drugs and things to try to keep the fish alive long enough so that they could pull them out and electrocute them or slit them, kill them. It's enormously cruel and extremely toxic, and people eat that stuff thinking they're getting some kind of imagined benefit, some omega-3s that are really healthy or something. And it's a huge waste of grain as well. Huge amounts of grain are fed to fish, huge amounts of fish are fed to other fish, and an enormous amount of suffering. A lot of people think that, well, fish, the fish is healthy and fish is a good thing to eat, but fish really concentrate virtually all the toxins that we produce. Heavy metals, PCBs, nuclear radiation, concentrating the flesh of fish, and especially in fish oil, which seems to be the thing people want to eat. And not only that, it's a huge thing we can talk about here, because the whole use of factory farming of salmon, for example, is devastating the wild salmon, because for a number of reasons. One of the reasons, actually, that's very interesting is the proliferation of sea lice. I don't know if you're familiar with sea lice, but sea lice have become a huge problem in oceans all over the world. Wherever there are these artificial factory farmed salmon operations, where the salmon are just fed other fish, and it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds of fish to make 1 pound of salmon. So it's enormously wasteful and devastating to the oceans. And they inject this toxic chemical into the flesh of the salmon that makes it pink, to make it artificially pink. And there's huge swarms of sea lice that just gather around these fish that are trapped and start eating the salmon from the outside in, which is extremely painful for the salmon. And fish, by the way, have central nervous systems just like we do. They feel pain the same way as other animals do, as dogs, cats, humans, especially around their mouths where they're hooked. The idea that fish don't feel pain is completely not supported by any of the research today. And that they have very complex social relationships. They have very high intelligence. They have intelligence at according to a lot of researchers, at the level of chimpanzees and other monkeys. So killing fish, hyper confining them, and then the problem with the sea lice is enormous, because these sea lice are spreading throughout large regions and killing the wild salmon as well. And especially just this last year, when the young salmon were coming down the rivers, especially up in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. Since they have in that same area a lot of salmon, artificial salmon farms, there's huge numbers of sea lice that, again, just kill the salmon, which would never happen in nature, but there's so many concentrated. So when the wild salmon came down, these young ones, these little sort of like adolescents, they were met with a massive clouds of sea lice, which just killed them all. And so there's been a real devastation now of the salmon in the Pacific, and I think the amount of pollution that these farms cause is just enormous. And when you look at this whole system of basically of just devastating the oceans with long line operations and with deep trawlers, and we have these industrialized fishing operations that basically completely strip mine the oceans to the point where there's large areas of the ocean where there just aren't hardly any fish left. The jellyfish are taking over other huge areas of the oceans that are now dead zones from all the runoff from feeding pigs and cows and chickens. There's the enormous amounts of fertilizer that runs off and causes what's called hypoxia, which is when the oxygen is depleted from the water and no fish can live. We're killing the oceans, and we're killing the land. And really, I think if we just took our top scientists and we said, "Listen, fellas, try to create a system, as a kind of a thought experiment that would maximize pollution and maximize environmental devastation and maximize the sheer suffering and pain of other living beings, of animals, and maximize disease," I don't think you could probably come up with a better system than what we've got in place now of feeding animals to humans and feeding the enormous amounts of grain and other inputs that are required in feeding, and then having the animals be killed and then confined and then fed to humans who get enormous sicknesses and diseases from these same animals and from this practice. So the repercussions of this, just on the physical level, are enormous. But what I was talking about earlier this evening is to just look at this a little more deeply, and what are the repercussions of this for ourselves spiritually. And I'm going to maybe take just a few minutes to talk about dairy right now. the operation of dairy farms, and just to think about this, what it does to us spiritually, because I think, in a sense, for me, the problem I have is that right now is that there's so much I want to convey in just a few minutes, and so I am really, honestly, not saying this in any self-promoting way, but I just really do hope to buy a copy of the World Peace Diet, because there's an enormous amount of information in there that will never be actually covered, at all in this presentation over the next 2 days. I just no way. I mean, the book is an audio book, and it's 13 and a half hours of me speaking and not repeating anything. So, but I'll just try to shed a few rays of light here onto this system that's basically a taboo to talk about. It's hidden and it's vast and it's connected to our food. And one of the things that I realized, besides this, the sheer power of food and the history of this whole thing, the way we got a little taste of that, the way the capitalist culture, which has a wealthy elite that takes a disproportionate amount of the resources and is founded upon meat eating, of eating the flesh. This is the high prestige food, as we heard, and how that system requires men to disconnect from their gentle side. It basically reduces women to the status of commodities that are used like cattle and other animals to give babies and to give pleasure. It reduces them to meat. This is a revolution that happened over many thousands of years, and it creates this a society based on war, where the fastest way to get rich quick is to steal someone else's livestock. Livestock is the capital, the wealth of the culture, and that this culture is spread throughout the United States, and it's basically still driving us today, because we're still eating the same way. We're still eating. At the end of the day, we go and we eat the flesh and secretions of brutalized animals. So the mentality of this old, ancient warring culture, the very first word for war on this planet, the old Sanskrit word gavya, literally translates to the desire for more cattle. That's the first word for war, because this was the way to get rich. And if you lost a war, then the men became slaves. Usually they were castrated. The women became concubines. The livestock became the property. And we had this vicious warfare going on that benefited the wealthy elite. Does that sound familiar? You hear that happening today? It's happening because we're still basically living the same way. So our culture yearns for a revolution, a transformation, a positive revolution. And I think this is what we're talking about here in the next few days, today and tomorrow. And the repercussions of this, of all of this, at its core, I think in many ways, is that what I call in the World Peace Diet, the domination of the feminine. The feminine is that dimension of us, whether we're male or female, that has a sensitivity to and a yearning to nurture and protect life. And I think this is something we all feel in our hearts, and yet it's something that is repressed in us. It was repressed in me as a kid. I know growing up in this culture, and I think our greatest calling is to feed that, to resensitize ourselves, and to connect with the beauty of this earth in a way that we yearn to protect it and celebrate it and be part of something positive and create more beauty. And so, if we look at what we're doing in animal agriculture in general, I think animal agriculture from the very beginning brought out the worst in us, because the animals from the very beginning resisted. They did not want to be confined. They did not want to have their babies stolen. They did not want to have their bodies stabbed and killed. So they've always been resisting. And so men have had, it's mainly been men's work, from the beginning have had to just bring out the part of themselves that was cruel and capable of violence, both against the animals and against other cowboys, other herders who were trying to steal their cattle. And so this has been the mentality from the very beginning. Whereas I think, honestly, that there are types of agriculture, gardening, that bring out the best in us. Where it's more women's work. It's more work where we're tending and nurturing and working with the cycles of nature, growing plants that we can eat. So this type of agriculture leads to domination, the animal agriculture, to a mentality of domination. And the first science, really, if you look back and go back, was men figuring out ways to dominate female animals. get so that they to genetically to breed them so that their babies would have more wool and more milk and give more meat. And this way of looking at nature and reducing it to things, looking at animals, reducing them to things, looking at what we call the wild animals, the free animals, looking at them basically as varmints, because instead of seeing them as mysterious cohabitants of a world that we can commune with and honor and respect, we started seeing them as potential attackers of our property, of our wealth, and so we tried to get rid of them and kill them. And we see that all over the United States now. There's a government agency called Wildlife Services, which basically services the wildlife by trying to kill them all off as much as it can. And every year is killing tens of thousands of coyotes and prairie dogs and ferrets and raccoons and birds of all kinds. So to protect the livestock of ranchers and farmers. So this war against nature has been at the core of what science is. Science is this eye of looking to control. And you wouldn't be able, I don't believe, to have animal agriculture today, especially factory farming, without the pretty much complete domination of the female reproductive organs. And you have to, I think, remember that it's mainly the female animals that are most violently dominated and abused in animal agriculture, because they're the ones that give birth to babies and they're the ones that give milk and eggs. And if we just look at for example, in the dairy industry, the way if a cow is born on a dairy, the chances are, first of all, probably, cows normally would live, say, 25 years. After 4 or 5 years, they're worn out, and they'll give birth to maybe 4 calves during their lives, and they're always impregnated on a rape rack. And so 3 out of those 4 babies, 1 will probably become a slave on the dairy. The other 3 will have to be killed, either for veal or just killed early on, or possibly be used for beef. So it's basically a rape and kill operation. And I think the cruelty in dairy cannot be overstated. It's an amazingly brutal business, because when a mother, first of all, she's given special hormones to bring her into heat very early. Then when she comes into heat, she's impregnated, and then after 9 months she gives birth to a baby. Then the baby's immediately stolen, which causes enormous grief to both the mother and the baby. And then she's immediately raped again, and then she's pregnant and lactating simultaneously, which breaks down the health of any mammal. I mean, any woman in here would know how you'd feel about that. As soon as you give birth, you're impregnated again, and your babies are stolen, you're impregnated again, your baby's stolen, you're impregnated again. This breaks down the health of any female very fast. And not only are they forced to be pregnant and lactating simultaneously, but they're forced to give much more milk than they normally ever would. Instead of giving just, say, 25 pounds of milk a day maximum, they're giving over 100 pounds of milk a day, and so there's a huge amount of calcium that's being, going out of their body because being forced to overproduce. So they have severe osteoporosis, as Harold was talking about, and so the downers that end up at the slaughterhouses who can no longer walk are typically dairy cows who have such severe osteoporosis that their bones just break. Slaughterhouse workers say you can break the bones of cows, dairy cows, in your bare hands. And so how do you get cows to give so much milk? Now that's another thing scientists figured out. Scientists figured out that if you feed them, first of all, if you give them a whole bunch of different hormones, they'll give a lot more milk: prolactin, oxytocin, progesterone, testosterone, other hormones. And then also, if you feed them cholesterol, they give more milk. And so cows don't not only just eat grain, which is already totally unnatural for them, they're given a lot of meat to eat, huge amounts of fish meal, of euthanized dogs and cats, of anything that comes from the rendered chickens, slaughterhouse waste. This is all given into it's called enriching their feed, and it basically forces their bodies to give a lot more milk, and it gives milk that has a higher fat content, which is good because that way, for profits, because higher fat content means more cheese and butter and so forth. So these cows are forced not only to be carnivores, but actually typically they were always cannibals as well, because until mad cow disease began happening because they were feeding cows to cows. They were just, so many babies are born on a dairy. They killed them and used the skin was valuable for the leather, but the flesh basically just and the rennet was good for making cheese. But very often they'd be fed back back into the food system and maybe even fed to their own mothers. So this kind of heartless violence against mothers, and I think this is something that we as a culture have kept hidden and covered up, and no one ever wants to think about. What we do to female animals typically and routinely over and over again. We could not do this if we hadn't completely blocked our own compassion and the inner divine feminine capacity. I think we all know in our bones that there's nothing more sacred and precious and worthy of our respect and caring than mothers giving birth to babies and nursing the babies and taking care of them. I think we know in our bones that we should let that happen. We shouldn't mess with that. And yet that is the very thing that this culture that we've been born into most violently and brutally engages in, is dominating and killing these females and stealing their babies and killing their babies. And this happens in pig operations, on fish operations, on dairy operations, on chicken, in every aspect of animal agriculture. That's the defining thing. And so in the World Peace Diet, I talk about how feminine intuitive wisdom, and the Greek tradition was called Sophia. And this is our inner wisdom, and it is Sophia that's been so reduced. And by basically killing off Sophia, our culture has created a warrior mentality against nature, against animals, and really against each other, that does violence at its very core to us spiritually. How can we ever hope to have peace and love and compassion and freedom and mercy and equality for ourselves when we sow the exact opposite seeds in all of our relations with other living beings who have interests just like we have interests, and whose interests to them are as important to them as my interests are to me? It's just we don't care about their interests. 150 years ago, we would say the same thing about black people. Well, we don't care. Their children are not their children. Their children are my children. And I'm going to do with them, if I want to kill them, that's fine. I do whatever I want with them because they're my children. And we say the same thing about the cows. Her children are not her children. They're my children. And I'll take them and I'll kill them and I'll use them for my benefit. So we steal their purposes, and what happens? We lose our purpose. We violate and dominate them and turn them into commodities, and what happens? We become enslaved, and we become commodities in a heartless economic system that basically enslaves us. And how is it ever going to be any other way until we awaken to the truth that we are all connected? If we want to have peace, we've got to give peace. If we want to have kindness, we've got to give kindness. If we want to have love, we've got to be loving to those beings who are in our hands. And this is the essential teaching that's in our bones. We know this. It's in every religious tradition. It's in every spiritual tradition. Whatever you would most want for yourself, give to others. And this is what we are so naive and so tragic, in a sense, that we just don't know this and we don't act on this. We pretend we don't know it. I used to teach a lot of college courses in world religions and mythology, and there's this wonderful understanding. You can just see it if you read the Greek tragedies. There's in all the tragedies, there's the hero. And the tragic hero, you can just see it as it unfolds, is going to fall. The tragic hero will fall. And the reason is, the tragic hero will fall is that his personality has defects. Two main defects. One is what the old Greek word was hubris, which means an overweening pride, just thinking he's better than anyone else. The other is obtuseness, just kind of like just not getting it, not somehow just not making the connections, not being able to connect the dots. And it's a loss of essential intelligence that is essentially forced on all of us. Growing up in this culture, intelligence is the ability to make connections. And yet if I'm eating the flesh of brutalized animals, I don't want to know that. I don't want to make that connection. I don't want to think about the pollution, the violence, the starving children, the horror and that I'm not only eating, but I'm eating it, I'm giving it to my loved ones, but I'm causing it. That's the thing we have to realize. We're not just eating it, we are causing it. Those poor people who are stabbing all day, they're only doing it because we're paying them to. You know, there's this great line by Emerson. You know, he said, "You have just dined, and however well the slaughterhouse is concealed by the graceful distance of miles, there is complicity." Isn't that great? There is complicity. We are complicit. If I take out my wallet and I pay for cheese or eggs or meat, that is the order, and somewhere there's going to be blood on the wall. You know, there's somewhere. And I remember seeing, you know, when I was in college, hearing about this, about the Vietnam. It was during the Vietnam War, and I was so shocked and I was so outraged. Really, as you know, I was only 20 years old. I guess you can be outraged when you're 20 years old. I guess I still get outraged even. But I remember hearing this guy came and gave a presentation. He talked about how the American, young American bombers, pilots would fly over these villages in Vietnam, and they'd drop bombs, and they would land in villages down below, and they would fly back to their base, and they wouldn't feel anything. They wouldn't bother them at all because they never saw what happened. They never saw the effects of pushing that button. They didn't see this. They didn't hear the screams, see the body parts flying. You could see the chaos and terror and pain and fear that they were causing. And so it didn't bother them. And even less the general who gave the order to send that bomber. And we are the same way in this culture. We don't want to know where that came from, where that bacon came from. We don't want to know was that pig conscious when she was skinned or not. We have no idea when we see a piece of flesh on our plate. So this is the essential dilemma that we're facing, that we have this disconnectedness, and the essential beauty and enormous blessing, I think, that we have as a culture is that we are not essentially warlike or violent or essentially greedy. I think we realize that essentially we have a good heart. Essentially, whenever we see an animal being hurt or someone, we want to stop that. We've been raised in a culture where this has been injected into us, and we feel so bad about it, we don't want to talk about it, we keep it hidden and covered over. Now is the time to talk about this and change our behavior. Because once we change our behavior and we're not actually causing it and we're not bringing that energy into ourselves anymore, then we become free. And so every dimension of what we're talking about, the environmental devastation to human beings, the starvation, the world hunger, the spiritual disconnectedness that we experience, the fact that a wealthy elite controls such a massive amount of wealth, that is basically from this same mentality that we enslave others and we essentially become enslaved. So I think usually I have someone giving me, I'm giving people telling me when their 5 minutes are up, and I think I've gone past my 5 minutes, so I better stop here. But I'd like to thank you all for listening to that, and just kind of move into the next part of our evening, which is really the final part, which is the question and answer time. And so just think of your questions for either of the three of us, and we'll come on up here and be happy to answer your questions. And I think in many ways we've only been able to scratch the surface of the whole issue and the dilemmas that we're facing, and also the possibilities for healing and blessing the world. So if you have a question, I'm wondering if we need to have it on tape. I know there's a fellow who was here taping a little while ago. But I guess if you have a question, just ask it. I think we can all hear each other. It's a small enough room, so let's just do it that way.
I have a question. For those of you who are now vegetarian, how did your families react when you were making that transition? How do they feel now about it? Have you felt successful within your own sphere in showing people the reasons for your choices and having them embrace that? Or has it actually been more difficult with the people who are closest to you to encourage them to be living a vegan lifestyle?
I can just say briefly, maybe, or unless you want to say something, but I'll just say briefly. That's a great question. Family, basically, it's. I think it's the hardest in many ways with our family members. They wonder what kind of crazy thing you're into. But from my point of view, it's gone very well, I'd have to say. And so my father really never bought into this stuff too much, and then he, of course, died pretty young after, I shouldn't say very young, but about 60 from cancer. And then my mother read my book and went vegan. And my wonderful wife, Madeline, I became a vegetarian back in 1975, in the end of December, and in Switzerland, a young woman on the very same day, I think, went vegetarian, and I ended up marrying her about 20 years later. So we've always been, vegan together, and that's been just fabulous for me. And then my sister, who's like my mother, is a born-again fundamentalist Christian, and I always was I've always been the person who was, in a sense, trying to get people to go vegan. And so I kept working on her, and sometimes she would get really upset. I remember one time we were visiting her, and she said, "You just think you're so superior, you just think you're just much better than everybody else because you're a vegan." And we just kind of listened. And then she saw this, I sent her a copy of this video called The Witness. I don't know if you've seen The Witness. And she watched it, and then a few days later she called me and she said, "The Lord came to me and told me to go vegan." So she's been a vegan now for over 12 years, I think.
And the God is Eddie Lama.
Right. Thanks to Eddie Lama. So my sister's vegan. Her 3 kids are pretty much vegan. My mother's vegan. My brother's mostly vegan. And Madeline's mother went vegan. And it's been really great because my mother's just turned 80, and Madeline's mother's in her 80s. And it's been wonderful to see the enormous health benefits that they've gotten by going vegan too. I mean, the word vegan means not doing it for health reasons. You do not go vegan for health reasons. That's not the reason. The reason, unless you say health, like health of all beings or something. But it's really for compassion and kindness. And but the side effect, the side benefit, I think, is really an enormous, much better physical thing. So my mother had asthma and allergies and all this stuff that all cleared up. Madeline's mother had arthritis and a lot of other problems. They all went away. And they're just both so happy and delighted that they're not eating any animal foods. And so if you have loved ones who are not vegan, you see, the thing is, we want to change someone. You can never change anyone. We can't change another person. All we can do is live our own truth as deeply as we can. And the deeper we do that, I think, then we can plant the seeds even more deeply. And just keep planting the seeds as deeply as you can. And I think we can have a positive effect on others. And so it's great, really. I mean, if I am ever with my family, the food thing isn't a problem for the most part. I mean, it's pretty much. I mean, my sister's husband, he's a gourmet chef, went to culinary school and all that sort. He's a little bit of a hard case. Anyone I found, if you're making a living, if you're making money at some kind of thing that uses animal foods, that can be tough. When someone's actually making money, like a restaurateur, or because they're making their living at it, that gets tough. They kind of like put up the wall pretty strongly. But just don't beat your head against the wall too much. Go to work with people who will maybe see the light. Thanks for the question.
Well, I can share my family experience. There's a lot of truth to what Will just said. There's that old saying, there's nothing harder to change than the mind of a man whose paycheck depends on him not changing his mind. Well, that's my brother. But it goes, because he still has a farm, but it kind of goes beyond that too. My brother is a fundamentalist minister. So it's brings a whole different dimension to it and stuff, because he has certain judgments that veganism is a cult, and it's a dangerous thing, and he prays for my soul constantly. So I'm sure I will go to heaven. I've got him on my side. But no, I can't claim the success that Will has with a family, but then I don't proselytize my family either. I'm an example, and if they choose to pay attention, they will. Both of my parents have passed away from heart disease. My brother, who's younger than I am, he's on medication. It's for high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and a year and a half ago, he got put on medications for type 2 diabetes. And while I'm a living example, I'm older than he is, and I was diagnosed with heart disease when I was 18 years old. Well, actually when I was 29 or 30, and I reversed my heart disease, and I'm on no medications, and I'm healthy. I'm not overweight like he is. You know, you have this example in front of you, and he just doesn't choose to make any changes. I think it comes down to human nature too. You know, we're crisis management oriented beings. We don't tend to make a change until we get a 2x4 upside the head. Well, I had a couple of twos. It took 2 or 3 or 4 2x4s to get my attention. But for other people, I guess he just hasn't had his. I can claim that I have a couple of my cousins, they have kids. There's 2 young girls in my family who have gone vegetarian in the last year. And I got these emails out of the blue from them. They said, "Oh, Cousin Harold, we know that we heard you're a vegetarian. Could you give us some information and stuff? Because Mom and Dad are clueless." So, and one's just going into college this semester, and the other one's still in high school. So, yeah, there's things happening, but I can't make those claims of my family. They're pretty entrenched, in the whole culture and the community and stuff. Because I came from a rural community and stuff, so it's a little bit different, really.
Roger.
My question is first for Clark and then Will and Harold if they'd like to comment. Clark, I understand that there are almost as many dogs as hogs in the United States today, not to mention cats, horses, etc. Isn't it time that we expanded this conversation to include domesticated animals that we don't eat?
Wow. Well, I'm not aware of those statistics. I know that there are a lot of horses and a lot of cats and animals, or cats and dogs. I'm sorry. So you're talking about animal liberation even among pets. Is that what your question gets to?
The resource allocation, environmental degradation, human health, and ethical issues around the animals that we say we keep because we love them, who are really part of a control dependency relationship, and who we assume love their role with us, but maybe if we would get beyond our human-centeredness, we would realize. For example, I also have read that there are more dogs in Juneau than wolves in all Alaska. Mm-hmm. And yet that's supposed to be a wild place. So, this is a huge issue, and these are the animals that we sleep with, that defecate on our sidewalks, in our parks, on our carpet. 2 of the biggest issues in air quality in the house, I think, are candles and pets. And so these are huge health issues. And there's an awful lot of resources that are consumed by cats and dogs and horses, and we don't eat those. But I go to these conferences and I don't hear this conversation. And I think the reason is because most of us have pets.
Well, I have 2 pets, and they're both rescued animals, and they're both neutered. For us, then the choice would be ignoring the population of animals that are rescued and just let them be put down, or adopting them. And we thought it was compassionate to adopt. But there are puppy mills that are, obviously, and Iowa is one of the places, Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, producing puppies under terrible, terrible conditions.
Yeah, I think it's great to bring that up because there are so many animals, and puppy mills are so serious. And the thing I guess we have to remember is that we always think that they just enjoy being with us, and we don't. I heard somebody the other day talking about dairy cows the same way, that they just enjoy getting their milk and they like being warm, and it's just nice for them. We love them. We take their milk and they give us their babies, and it's all a lovey-dovey thing. But I think if we get out of this mentality that these animals are just here for us, I think people feel like, but gosh, I want to relate to animals. I want to relate to animals. I don't want to give up having my dog and my cat. I think the next step for us as human beings is to besides going vegan as a culture, I think it is to let go of forcing animals to be in this subservient position where they're just totally dependent on us as pets, and to have meaningful relationships with wild, free animals, which is a very exciting possibility. And I think a lot of people have done that to some degree. I think if we go out into nature and just see and be with animals on their terms, in their environment where they're free, we can get amazing teachings and gifts and very profound experiences. Have you ever just looked into the eyes of a wild coyote or a bobcat, or just watched eagles or cranes? It's an amazingly fulfilling experience. And I think that if we go out into nature and really stay there for some time, we will begin to have experiences with wild animals that are very profound. So I'll just leave it at that, I guess, at the moment. Thanks.
Well, I would totally agree with you on that subject, but unfortunately we're tending to move the other direction. And it's like in New York right now, there's legislation proposed to make dogs come under the purview of the USDA as livestock because of the puppy mills and the breeding trade and the AKC. And that, but of course, when we think of if they now register them under that, and there's a move afoot in other states like Pennsylvania and certain other states where you see puppy mills, but even what you would call legitimate dog breeding, they want to push legislation through that would bring dogs under the heading of livestock with the USDA. Okay, we don't eat dogs in this country, but they do in other countries. We slaughter horses in the United States and ship the meat to France. It's a revenue stream for Mustangs, for spent saddle horses and stuff, and that's, of course, the United States. Of course, and who's to say this isn't the kind of the trajectory we're on with this? Because then we make dogs. Well, there's a lot of Pacific Rim countries who eat dog. So we take these otherwise perceived illegitimate and dog breeding facilities, and it just opens up a new market for them. And if they're livestock, then we just breed them. We'll then have, confined breeding and raising operations for dogs to be made into meat to be sent to, Indonesia. So it is a dialogue we have to have, because it isn't about how much we're like animals. That's not the question. When it kind of frustrates me when I see studies about animal intelligence. It's really interesting stuff to me. But that's not the question. It's not how they're so much like us. The point is that leave them the heck alone. I mean, if anybody ever wonders what animal rights is, that's all it is. It just means leave the animals alone. Leave them to their own devices, because they do have their own interests, and they are subjects of a life. And they are not on... I wish I could remember that Alice Walker quote about, and she's an African American woman who, I'll paraphrase, but basically that they're here for their own purposes and not ours, any more than slaves.
Men are for women, women are made for men, and blacks are made. Yeah, animals are no more made for people than blacks were made for whites or women were made for men.
Yeah.
So we just broadened it out a little more. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
I have a question for you, Mr. Brown. You mentioned that the cattle that are fed
Well, all dairy operations feed grain because you need high energy feeds to maximize milk production. So that would be all dairies, doesn't matter scale, whether you want to call it organic or conventional. For beef cattle, there would be the vast majority of beef cattle in the United States because that's what feedlots are for. You'd have, a steer out on pasture for about 11 to 12 months. Then you put them in feedlot about 2 months and get them up to slaughter weight, and then you send them in. So there you've got it. The only place you probably wouldn't find it in cows would be, a strictly grass-fed operation, which tends to be the smaller niche market for, like Whole Foods or something like that.
But does it cause acidosis in all cattle that are fed grain, or is it just something that might occur?
No, it always occurs
It always occurs.
because they're pure herbivores, and actually grains cause acidosis in us too because more and more research is coming out that we're not really omnivores. We're not omnivores. We're herbivores too because eating grains. I knew a woman in Cleveland who died of cirrhosis of the liver, which is high acidosis, alcohol, and the fermentation of that in your gut. And she died of it, and she was a teetotaler. But she ate a loaf of bread every day. She was into artisan breads. And for like 20 years, she ate a loaf of bread a day. And the doctors said she died, she had cirrhosis of the liver. She died from acidosis. And it was from her diet. I mean, other than that, she ate a really reasonable diet, as far as I was concerned. But, nothing extreme or anything except for the bread. I mean, she was eating a whole big loaf of European crusty bread, that delicious stuff we all like. But she was eating a whole loaf every day, and that did her in. So, and there's research. There's a guy named Doug Graham who trains elite athletes. He's a raw food guy, but he's got a small booklet out about grains being poison to human beings, and there's a lot of research to bear that out. We can eat some and not have any adverse effect. Eat too much, we do. Cows, yes. I mean, another example of that is years ago, when I was growing up, we were supposed to eat, we were told by the USDA, and our mothers told us we had to have liver once a week for iron. Does that sound like really strange? You have to eat liver once a week? Okay. Yeah, you're another generation. But we had to have liver once a week, liver and onions. We had it once a week, and it was to get iron, because it's rich in iron. Liver, on the first point, my mom made us eat it, but we were always challenging her about it, because what's the liver do in the human body? Any biology people in here? It's the filter of your body that gets all the crap out of your bloodstream and what you eat and stuff. So you're taking this loaded down like air filter out of your car and chowing on it, it can't be good for you. You talk about bioaccumulation. Well, liver would be the worst thing to eat. But you go to a supermarket now and look for, I go into markets, I go down the meat counters and I look for liver. Now why is this? It's because we've gone to feedlots and feeding beef cattle, and it causes acidosis. And I've had personal experience with this, that giving them high energy grains causes this acidosis, and it causes liver tumors. And sometimes there's a built-in attrition rate of about 2% of all beef cattle that go to slaughter that die in transport because these tumors explode and they die. So what I'm saying is when you take the liver out of that cow, when you disassemble them at the slaughter plant, you take that liver out, that there's so many tumors in that liver that there's no way you could sell it to the public. I mean, they would look at it and go, ew, So that's why you don't see liver in supermarkets anymore. It's because we've switched over to grain diets for cattle. That's way more than you needed to know.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, for each of the members, if you had a single defining moment that helped you choose your path, and if you had to come up with one statement that you thought we as individuals could do to make a change in your own area of expertise, whatever it could be, as volunteers.
I want to think on that. Well, I actually, thanks. That's a great question. And I'll just try to be really brief here. But I think the defining moment for me, probably, I didn't know it yet, but it was probably when I was at that camp challenge when I was only 13 years old, and we were bringing this, the second time I went to this camp, the second year, we were pulling this cow up to a grassy knoll where we were going to kill her for food. And I was into it. I thought it's going to be good. So we were bringing her up there, and we couldn't bring her. She wouldn't go. I mean, we were trying to pull her with a rope, and we couldn't get her. So we finally attached a chain around her neck and put it on the back end of a four-wheel drive pickup truck, and we just started pulling her up there with this chain on a four-wheel drive pickup truck. And we got almost up there, and she broke the chain. She was resisting so strongly. She broke this heavy chain, and I remember looking back at this cow, who I basically just saw as a dairy machine, just something that was going to give us, like Heifer International says, animals are here for the 4 M's: meat, milk, manure, and money. That's their purpose, right? So she wasn't giving enough milk, so we'll use it for meat. And I suddenly, for a brief instant, I remember seeing her as a being, as a mother who wanted to live, and I suddenly thought to myself, let's just not do this. But the programming was so thick that right away this other thought came in, which was, no, you can't do that. You've got to eat her. You can't just feed this cow. That's the whole point of it, is that they're here for us to use. We're not going to just feed this cow and not get something out of her. So I think that for me was a defining point in my life, although I kept eating meat for many years after that, for another 10 years. And then I think if I had one takeaway message, it would be just to please just do as much research as you can to find out about yourself and your culture. What are we intended to eat, and what are the ramifications of our food choices? I don't think there's anything more beneficial, not only to yourself and your loved ones, but to the earth and to the animals and to future generations, than to just say no to eating animal foods, and that no rides on a big yes, which is saying yes to kindness and compassion and freedom for all living beings. And when we bring our life into alignment with that inner yearning for peace and kindness and live it at the daily dinner plate level, our whole life transforms, and we just connect with the inner joy and peace and love that I think are our true nature. We begin to just see the beauty on the earth, and we begin to have a feeling for all life, and life becomes a great blessing. And so I just would say that question everything about this culture and do the best you can to root out of yourself what's been injected into you, that mentality of domination and objectification and violence that really all of us has been forced into us. And as we do that, we can transform this planet one person at a time. It's a grassroots kind of thing. And as Gandhi said, we must be the change we want to see in the world. Thanks.
Well, I really like what Will has said, and I'm still working on that. I certainly have been trying to understand our culture as much as possible, to understand really how it works and why it works, and what these buried programs are. And I think it's a hard thing to deal with.
Yeah, that's, I would say my defining moment was one day with a steer named Snickers. It's odd that a cow, and a steer in particular, would be my lesson giver. But I would say, to put it as simply as I can, that was my defining moment. And the advice that I would give anybody is have the courage to look inside yourself, be authentic, and what is required of us to be peaceful within, to manifest it outside, and to the rest of the world, is emotional courage, moral imagination, and the intestinal fortitude to ask the hard questions of ourselves. It isn't a change that comes from outside of you. It happens inside of you. And so everything you need to know is in you. You just got to create the safe space to do it. And I was lucky enough to have that happen in my life and to have a community of people who could support me in that. And because if I hadn't had that, I probably wouldn't be here today. But that's basically what I boiled that down to, is moral imagination, emotional courage, and just asking the hard questions, deconstructing your indoctrination. And you can go a long ways with that. And I think it applies more than just your relationship with animals, but with with just about any other thing in our culture, in our lives or our family relationships and stuff. I think it works pretty well for all of that too. Thanks for the question.
All right. Are there any other questions? We have a whole evening tomorrow, and it's gone a little bit past where we said I'd like to kind of maybe wrap up. Can we do a little? I'll do a short wrap up. Let's give a big hand to the panel. Thank you very much. And I appreciate it. And a hand to yourselves too. Tomorrow night, do you remember off the top of your head the subtitle of tomorrow night's presentation? It's basically the social, spiritual, cultural dimensions of our treatment of animals for food. And we are going to continue the conversation. We'll have Erica, raise your hand please, Erica with us tomorrow evening. We'll get more into the nitty-gritty of vegan nutrition, of how we really live. This is so much more. I mean, this is a vast subject. And there's so much more, and we'll have more time, obviously, for questions as well. And I really do encourage you to, if you can, get a copy of the book and read it between now and tomorrow of the World Peace Diet. Just stay up all night and read the book, and then you'll have some good questions. And I'm happy to sign books. We also, Melanie has the prints of the paintings. And I'd like to just close, I think, because we've just taken in a lot of information. We probably have feelings, a lot to process. I'd like to just close our time with a short piece of piano music. So please just sort of sit tight for a moment here, and I'll just go to the piano. Actually, what I'll do, I'll say it on the tape here, on the microphone, is I'd like to just play a short piece of music called Benediction of Light, and just invite all of us to just take a moment and just tune into that inner spot within our own hearts where the light shines, the light of love and compassion, a sense of peace, a sense of knowing that we have a purpose to fulfill on this planet, that we have a reason for this lifetime, and that as we get in touch with that reason, that we're here, we connect in with our own inner joy and the beauty that we essentially are, and that we're here to contribute to the raising of human consciousness and to the evolution on this planet of a culture where there's actually a foundation where peace and justice and sustainability are possible. It is possible. I think we know that in our core, that there is a fundamentally essential benevolent quality to ourselves, and that as we bring our lives into alignment with that, we become the force of healing on this planet. So this is called Benediction of Light, and we can perhaps join together and create a field of peace and love. Thank you very much. Here's Benediction of the Light. Thank you all so much for joining us. Really, please do come back. Erica, can you just say like one sentence of what you're affiliated, the name of the group you're affiliated with, and your thing you're doing?
I'm part of the Iowa nonprofit Center for Plant-Based Diet Development. Tomorrow I'll be talking about vegan nutrition, giving you some basic information about what you eat when you're vegan. And then secondly, I'll talk about some of the barriers that exist that might prevent you from choosing to be vegan. There are a lot of barriers, but I do feel they're worth overcoming, just as Will Tuttle and the others have talked about.
Right, so we're going to share some secrets tomorrow. You do not want to miss this. So please come back tomorrow. Much love to you all, and see you tomorrow.
Just do it, you know.